Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I find myself surprised to have a speaking slot tonight. And for that, I want to thank the New Democratic Party. We don't agree about this bill, but it was a generous gesture to allow me to speak to it. I have been very engaged in the issue of anti-terrorism legislation for many years. I followed it when immediately after 9/11, under former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, the anti-terrorism legislation went through this place. Although I was executive director of Sierra Club, I recall well my conversations with former MP Bill Blakey, who sat on the committee, and we worried as legislation went forward that appeared to do too much to limit our rights as Canadians in response to the terrorist threat. But that was as nothing compared to what happened when we had a shooting, a tragic event in October of 2014, when Corporal Nathan Cirillo was murdered at the War Memorial. I don't regard that event, by the way, as an act of terrorism, but rather of one individual with significant addiction and mental health issues, something that could have been dealt with if he'd been allowed to have the help he sought back in British Columbia before he came to Canada, to Ottawa, and committed the horrors of October 22nd, 2014. But it was the excuse and the opening that the former government needed to bring in truly dangerous legislation. I will never forget being here in my seat in Parliament on January 30th. It was a Friday morning. One doesn't really expect ground-shaking legislation to hit you without warning on a Friday morning in this place. No press release, no briefings, no telling us what was in store for us. I picked up Bill C-51, an omnibus bill in 5 parts, and read it on the airplane flying home, studied it all weekend, and came back here, and by Monday morning, February 2nd, had a speaking spot during question period and called it the Secret Police Act. I didn't wait, holding my finger to the wind, to see which way the political winds were blowing. The NDP did that for 2 weeks before they decided to oppose it, and the Liberals decided they couldn't win an election if they opposed it, so they would vote for it, but promised to fix it later. I'm afraid some of that is still whirling around in this place. I think that this effort, I will say, I am supporting, I'm voting for it. I still see many failures in it. I know the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Public Security have listened. That's clear. The work they did in the consultation process was real. But let me go back and review why C-51 was so very dangerous. I said it was a bill in 5 parts, and boy, when I hear the Conservatives tonight complaining that we're pushing that the government side is pushing C-59 through too fast. January 30th, 2015, C-51, an omnibus bill in 5 parts, was tabled for first reading. It got all the way through the House by May 6th. Got all the way through the Senate by June 9th, 2015, less than 6 months. This bill, C-59, was tabled just about a year ago. And before it was tabled, we had consultations. I had time to hold town hall meetings in my riding specifically on public security, espionage, our spy agencies, what we should do to protect and balance anti-terrorism measures with civil liberties. We worked hard on this before it ever came for first reading, and we've worked hard on it since. Back to C-51 that was forced through so quickly. It was a bill in 5 parts, and what I came to learn through working on that bill was that it made Canadians less safe. That was the advice from many experts in anti-terrorism efforts, from the leading experts from the trenches and from academia. From people like Professor Kent Roach and Professor Craig Forsyth, who worked so hard on the Air India inquiry, the chair of the Air India inquiry, former Judge John Major, as well as from people in the trenches I mentioned earlier in debate tonight, Joe Fogarty, an MI5 agent from the UK who served as an anti-terrorism liaison with Canada. And what I learned from all of these people was C-51 was dangerous because it would put in concrete silos that would discourage communication between spy agencies. So that bill in 5 parts, part 1 was information sharing. It wasn't about information sharing between spy agencies. It was about information sharing about Canadians to foreign governments. In other words, it was dangerous to the rights of Canadians overseas and ignored the advice of the Maher inquiry. Part 2 was about no-fly lists. Fortunately, this bill fixes that, but those no-fly list provisions, the previous government never even bothered consulting with the airlines, by the way. That was interesting testimony we got back in the 41st Parliament. Part 3 I just called the thought chill section. We've heard tonight that the government is not paying attention to the need to get terrorist recruitment off of websites. Nonsense. But Part 3 of C-51 created a whole new term with no definition, this idea of terrorism in general, and the idea of promoting terrorism in general. The way it was defined, Mr. Speaker, you could imagine somebody would be guilty of violating that law if they had a Facebook page that put up the image of a clenched fist. That could be seen as promoting of terrorism in general. So thank goodness we've gotten that improved. It actually, in terms of thought chill, because it was so broadly worded, could have caused, for instance, someone in a community that could see someone was being radicalized could create a fear, a reasonable fear that they could be arrested if they went to talk to someone who was being radicalized to talk them out of it. It was so badly drafted. Part 4 is the part that we didn't get fixed enough in this bill. This is the part that for the first time ever gave CSIS what are called kinetic powers. CSIS was, we'll all recall, created because the RCMP, in response to the FLQ crisis, was cooking up plots that involved, famously burning down a barn. And they thought, okay, we've got to have intelligence gathering separate from the guys who go out and break up the plots because we can't have the RCMP burning down barns. So they created the Canadian Security Intelligence Service to be exclusively about collecting information. And then the RCMP could act on that information. I think it's a huge mistake that in C-59 we've left CSIS having kinetic powers to disrupt plots. But we have changed this law quite a bit to deal with their ability, CSIS's ability, to go to a single judge to get permission to violate our laws and break the charter. I wish this was stronger in terms of the repair in C-59, but it's certainly a big improvement on C-51. By the way, Part 5 of C-51 is not repaired in C-59, and I think that's because it was so strangely worded that most people didn't ever figure out what it was about. I know Professors Roach and Forces left Part 5 alone because it was about changes to the Immigration and Refugee Act. It really was hard to see what it was about. But Professor Donald Galloway at the University of Victoria Law School said, Part 5 is about, in secret hearings, being able to give a judge information about a prospective suspect and not tell the judge that the evidence was obtained by torture. So I really hope the Minister of Public Safety will go back and look at those changes to the Refugee and Immigration Act, and if that's what they're about, they need fixing. Now let's look at why this bill is enough of an improvement that I'm going to vote for it. And by the way, in committee, Mr. Speaker, I did bring forward on my own 46 amendments to this bill. They went in the direction of, for instance, ensuring that we had special advocates in the room so that there'd be someone there on behalf of the public interest when a judge is giving a warrant to allow a CSIS agent to break the law or violate the charter. The language around what a judge can do and how often they can do it and what respect for the charter they must exercise when they grant such a warrant is much better in this, but it's still there, and it does worry me that there's no special advocate in the room. So I did try. I can't say I'm wildly enthusiastic about C-59, but it's a huge improvement over what we saw in the 41st Parliament, as it was called in C-51. The creation of the Security Intelligence Review Agency is something I want to talk about in my remaining minute. This is fundamental. This was what Mr. Justice John Major told the committee studying this bill back in 2015. He chaired the Air India inquiry. He told us it's just human nature. The RCMP and CSIS won't share information. You need to have pinnacle oversight. Now, there's review that happens, and the term review is post facto. So CIRC, Security Intelligence Review Committee, would look at what CSIS had done over the course of a year. But up until this bill, we have never had a single security agency that watched what all the guys were doing, guys and girls. We have CSIS, we have the RCMP, Canadian Border Services Agency, the Communications Security Establishment, and 5 different agencies, all looking at collecting intelligence, but not sharing. That's why it's a big improvement to have this bill and the creation of Security Intelligence Review Agency. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for St. John's East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for her excellent remarks. And she brings a lot of context to bear on some of the questions that were referred earlier in comparing Bill C-51. The member for Calgary-Shepherd had actually asked me about a proposed amendment that the Conservatives had brought forward to C-59 at committee about changing the word promote to the words advocate or counsel. And there was a brief moment in the member's speech where she did refer to some reasons why that would not be a good amendment, and maybe if she could elaborate on it, her answer to the member for Calgary-Shepherd's question might be better than mine was. Thank you.
Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, the member for St. John's East. Yeah, this was a very troubling provision about what kind of information posted in social media could lead to criminal charges in jail. And C-51 talked about the previously unknown concept of, quote-unquote, terrorism in general. What did it mean? Nobody knew. The concept of promoting terrorism, on the other hand, promoting terror or counseling terrorist activities, both of those words make sense to anyone within a legal context. Promoting is vague, counseling is clear. Terrorism in general is vague, terrorism is clear. So counseling terrorism is a clearly understood and defined offense, and therefore useful to security and protecting public safety. The way it was phrased in C-51 was thought chill over who knows what, but essentially draconian.
Questions and comments. The
honourable member for Trois-Rivières. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague for his speech. He put things in their proper context, but we're dealing with a basic piece of legislation whose purpose is to protect all Canadians and to protect their individual freedoms. Doesn't my colleague find it a little strange that we are debating such a basic piece of legislation subject to time allocation, even though we have sometimes diverging views and sometimes overlapping views? Isn't it a little strange that the Liberals are putting us in a position where we are voting on the less worst bill instead of voting on the best possible one? Thank you to my colleague. Yes, absolutely. I am always against time attribution. It is anti-democratic and disrespectful towards us as members of Parliament. Unfortunately, in this month of June 2018, all of our debates are under time allocation. Nevertheless, I want to say that with regard to this bill, C-59, it is a real improvement in terms of protecting the rights of Canadians and in terms of protecting Canada itself.
The honourable member for Central Nova.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Speaker, and it's always a pleasure when the honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands has the opportunity to partake in a debate, and particularly when it's one as important as this. Over the course of the debate and the consultation ahead of time, much attention has been given to the specific wording used in the legislation, but I'd like to shift gears a little bit and consider the social context in which an important piece of legislation like this exists as compared to C-51. My wife was working for a civil liberties organization at the time that C-51 was coming through the last Parliament, and one of the things that greatly disturbed me was that there are members of the Muslim community that she had worked with who expressed that because of the measures included in C-51 and the general sort of tenor of government at the time and the anti-Muslim bend that it had, there were people who previously came to some of their public education seminars who refused to keep coming because they feared the government would be watching them. These are the very people that we should be engaging with to ensure that they're bringing positive messages about the good relationship that the government can have with minority communities back to their communities. community to foster a healthy relationship. I'm curious if the honourable member has any commentary on the importance of public education and outreach to minority communities when we're dealing with legislation that could impact the rights, particularly when racial profiling is so important in this case.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands, a short response, please.
I thank the member for Central Nova. I remember it well, the climate of fear that C-51 created. I remember meeting with young Islamic women who told me, Canadian-born, their whole lives, who said for the first time they felt afraid. They didn't feel welcome. That climate has been largely pushed back, and I think it's on all sides, all parties. I'll give credit to everyone in this place to push back on Islamophobia. But it's critical, then again, back to what was in Part 3 of C-51, it's important that we not try to limit in any way the ability of, for instance, a local imam to reach out to someone in that community and say, don't listen to so-and-so. That's a misunderstanding of Quran. This is the real Quran, which is one that will have nothing to do with violence. And that's an important feature that C-59 helps protect.